How could a 60-year-old bike look like this? Stay tuned and you'll find out. Welcome to another video for One Loose Sprocket, and in this video we will discuss and review the restoration of a 1960s BELKNAP Bluegrass 3-speed bike. And it's going to, I actually started the restoration before I started my channel, so I don't have a whole lot of actual photos of the before. However, I did find a few things online about the era of the bike, not necessarily the exact bike, but close enough that I thought it was worth mentioning in what I was doing there. A picture here of a bike that has the same logo and things like that. And I found out through some investigation that BELKNAP did not make bikes. They were our hardware manufacturing company and would purchase and rebadge other bikes. Things like Huffman, which of course became Huffy. Raleigh, they actually used some Raleigh bikes as well. And some other things they even use Rollfast, which actually that's a teaser, because I actually was able to obtain a Rollfast, which would probably be another vintage bike restoration video in the future. So stay tuned. But regardless, what I did do is found enough information that I could see that this was from the 1960s. I think this is probably from 1962, around that era. There's some interesting components, so without spending too much time on the preamble, I will go ahead and dive into the breakdown of the bike and describe some of the things that I went through. So to begin the teardown process, I removed the front wheel prior to teardown, so I actually just started with the fender. From there, I removed the rear wheel by taking off the shifter and the push rod, then loosening of the bolts. Then I removed the 4 bolts that hold on the rear fender. I looked at both fenders, they didn't look too bad. Just some rust and a dent on the rear fender, and I will need to figure out what I'm going to do about that if I can get that out. Next, I removed the rear brake and the brake lever, which I'd removed from the handlebar previously, and then took off the front brake. From there, I removed the 3-speed shifter from the handlebars. I didn't remove it completely because I then wanted to remove the handlebars themselves. Once I loosened up the gooseneck or quill stem retaining bolt, a whack or two with my mallet, and it was an easy process to remove. I used a PVC pipe to help steady the fork while I removed the handlebar, and that is actually very effective in removing the lock nut as well. So there's one bicycle hack that you can take home with you. Then I removed the lock nut, the lock washer, and the top bearing cone from the fork. Once I did that, I was able to see inside, and not to my surprise, the grease was completely dry. So luckily the bearings did not look bad, they just were not well lubricated. I then removed the bearing cups with a breaker bar and hammer, and these cups were not pressed in tightly, so they actually popped out real easily. As I mentioned before, I believe this is a Raleigh rebadged as a Bluegrass using Shimano components for the most part, and I have more on that later. After removing the fork, I then removed the shift cable with the retaining clip and pulley. The pulley is my indicator that this is a Raleigh, because I did see the same pulley on another Raleigh 3-speed I restored in the past. From there, I removed the crank, which I had already overhauled in a previous video, and you can see that here. I will always say that one-piece cranks are so easy to work with. They might get dirty quicker and get stuff into the grease because they're not sealed, but they are always easily serviceable, something that the cycling community has moved away from and more towards sealed bearings. I was in the process of removing the lock nut and washer, then remembered, oh yeah, I need to take off the pedal, the left pedal. So after that, I removed the 3 pieces that hold on the crank, then slipped it out from the bottom bracket. As with the head tube, I popped out the bearing cups, which were also pressed in without too much difficulty. I did a quick inspection and noticed that there was some dried mud in the bottom bracket. So I cleaned it out, and I didn't think too much of it now, but that will resurface later. Once I have a naked frame, a full cleaning is done using my mineral spirits gasoline mixture to remove any dirt, grease, or residue that I could. While I'm doing this, I am inspecting the finish and blemishes I find. Some scratches were seen, but overall it didn't look too bad. Once I cleaned it with the first solution, I used rubbing alcohol to clean off the solution I used, since I don't want it to attack the paint. Since this frame was not overly abused, I opted to clean it and put a clear coat on it, more than anything to retard the rusting process. I wasn't too concerned with the finish, only because I knew I was going to be clear coating. I attacked the major rust areas with the Dremel tool and miniature wire brush, and I didn't want to spend too much time on it, just more or less get it clean and prepped for the clear coat. And once I had most of the surface rust off, it was not that bad after all, and it did clean up rather well. So after I had done all my cleaning and prepping and stuff like that, I noticed that it had some mud or dried something and some weird material sitting in the bottom bracket. And the more I looked at it, I realized that it had fallen down from within the seat tube, and then started to poke around inside there. Found out that apparently some mud daubers had gotten into the seat tube and had made a nest, and whatever was left over was actually dropping down. So I took a bit of a large pipe cleaner and cleaned it out as best I could to try to remove all of that excess stuff, because that was not good at all. And of course I didn't want it dropping down inside the newly refurbished, or as I was doing the restoring piece, so I definitely want to get rid of all that stuff. The last piece I cleaned was the head badge. It was quite dingy and was yellowing due to age, so I definitely wanted to make it shine. Therefore I simply used some elbow grease and alcohol. I didn't want to rub off the existing clear coat, otherwise I might lose some of the lettering. I attacked it vigorously, and the results were startling. After removing the last little imperfections that I wanted to remove, the little bit more rust that I found on some certain spots there, I was pretty much ready to go ahead and put on my clear coat. I was able to support my frame using a PVC pipe that I had held in my bike stand, and from there then I had complete access to the rest of the frame to go ahead and apply at least 2 coats of clear coat. I didn't want to overdo this too much, because of course it is still coated with the original coating that they put on the bike, but enough that it also would give it a nice gloss and protect more than anything those parts where the rust had been most noticeable. So I could see that the badges were there. Again, the coat did allow you could still see some of the rust, but again, now it's protected, so that will slow down any rusting for the most part, that it will not have any significant impact. I also cleaned up the fork by removing the fork crown race and the chrome cap on the fork, then cleaned the surface as best possible on the fork and the chain guard. I had to be a little careful as I was actually removing paint from the chain guard, so a very light clean was all I could do. Then I straightened the guard a little in one spot, and it was on to the coating. I inverted the fork in my bike stand and then hung the chain guard from the fork using an old spoke as a hanger. While the clear coat was drying, I cleaned the rust off the fork cap, and from there you can see the results of the coating process without any need to sand or buff. Not too bad for a rattle can. Okay, so the first thing I do is look at all the parts, just kind of inspect them, and then I started cleaning up the lock washer, and it was well chromed, so the cleanup was actually quite easy to do, and it started to shine immediately with my little wire brush on my little Dremel tool. I kind of put that on the side, said okay, that's good, looking nice, and then I started in on the top bearing brace, and same thing, because it wasn't chromed as much, it was more just hardened steel, then it didn't look as clean or as beautiful as the lock nut, but hey, it was close enough. I was like, that's looking pretty good. So I started to soak the bearings as well, and started in on one of the bearing cups, and realized that it was quite caked on there with some dried grease that had been there who knows how long. And so I scraped at it with my little awl as well as with my knife, and just, you know, scraping off stuff. Then I started to polish it a little bit, and it was getting quite a bit off there, but there was just so much stuff buried down inside the groove that I had to continue working with the steel wool, with my awl, with the knife, and just alternated between all of them until I got it looking pretty good. And you can see there is some wear on that cup, but overall it does look really, really nice. So started in on the next one, and you know, again, the same process, just scrape at it, work at it, clean it up, make sure that I could get all the old junk off of it, and you know, clean with the solvent until I could see that it was, you know, I polished it with some steel wool again. And once I started to see what I wanted to see as far as the other one was concerned as well, then I left it on the side and started in on the bearings. And the bearings the same way, there's definitely some stuff caked inside there, and I had to work at it quite a bit to get the junk off the actual race, the spacer, the bearing spacers themselves, as well as in between where the grease had caked inside the spacer, and I had to dig it out with whatever I had, you know, obviously with my awl, and just using my punch to do it. Then once I got the bearings looking pretty good, I was like, hey, so this is now getting to the point where I'm feeling happy about the way things were sitting. They fit inside the cups nicely, and just went back after a little bit on the spacer washer, just to make sure that was looking nice and had a nice clean look to it. Used my little Dremel on it a little bit more. Once I felt it looked pretty good, then just did a last inspection, and this is the final result. So you can see that the cup itself looks great. Again, just a little bit of wear. Bearings, no problems whatsoever. All of them looked very clean. No pitting. None of them were chewed up. So I was able to reuse them as they were, with no need to replace any bearings or to replace the bearing spacer either. And the lock nut, and as well as the bearing race, also look very nice. Just not an issue whatsoever, as far as, again, you see a little bit of wear to be expected for the top race, but again, is that lock nut that just, man, what a shine. That thing it just came out beautiful. So I did spot a little bit of something on there, and I was like, well, I'll just hit it with a little steel wool, just kind of clean that up. Then I used my cup compressor and put it together, and I said, okay, I'll compress this to basically seat both the cups back onto the head tube. And strangely enough, as I was doing this, which is typical with most bikes, they would stay in. And I was a little surprised about that, because I assumed that they would stay, because typically they do, but apparently the engineering wasn't as precise back in the day, and I could have just put them in there by hand and it would have been about the same, but they held, so I was happy with that. And then I started re-greasing everything, greasing the cups, greasing the bearings, and both the top bearing and the bottom bearing, and the same thing, put a little grease on the crown race, on the fork itself, and there you go. Then I went ahead and put the threaded race on the top, and just went ahead and locked that down. Got it to the point where I felt pretty comfortable with the spacing, and went ahead and put the spacing washer on there as well as the lock nut, and tightened that down. Because I didn't want to mess up the race on the top, then I just grabbed it with a rag instead of, I usually would grab it with some pliers or something like that. But I didn't have that, so I just went ahead and did this. It was walking on me a little bit, so I had to hold up my knee as I twisted it until I got it to the point where I was pretty happy with the adjustment there. You see the rotation is really nice, very smooth. Considering the age of this bike, it actually was quite nice.
For the one-piece crank, the video link above is a description about how to disassemble, clean, and reassemble the crank. For the restoration, however, I went ahead and cleaned the parts using the standard method of steel wool and the wire brush. The parts were the bearing cups, bearings, the bearing cages, bearing races, and the washer and lock nut. I paid closer attention to the bearing cups this time, as well as the lock nut, and making sure the visual appearance was more in line with my restoration of the bike. The pedals were handled previously by the Vintage Crank video. I attached the bearing cups on the bottom bracket, but just like the headset, the cups slid in without too much effort. I then mounted the crank from the crank side by sliding the crank side bearings onto the crank, went ahead and put the opposite side bearings with the bearing cage, as well as putting on the bearing cone to bring it into tension with the rest of the crank. Again, the engineering here is so simple, yet so ingenious in the simplicity of what it is, and yet the pure effectiveness of being able to use this as a nice mechanical cranking method. It's amazing how the cycling industry has moved on to more complex cranks, but the overall, or I should say, the basic function of what a crank does is still the same. Yes, they have reduced the weight, but the strength that is available for this one-piece crank is simply phenomenal, and I cannot say too much about it. As always, I had a great time restoring the wheels. I already knew that I had a broken spoke on the rear wheels, so that was a given that I would be rebuilding it. The front wheel wasn't too bad. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of video on the actual cleaning, but I was able to repack the bearings, clean the rim, and true the wheel. I really don't need to show too much because I spent an exorbitant amount of time on the rear wheel. More to come. As you see, I'm mounting the new tire on the rim, and once that was done, I really didn't have anything more to do with it other than mount the wheel on the bike. Okay, now to start on the rear wheel. I spent many hours on this, partly due to the age of the bike and the lack of documentation and guidance, and partly because of the technology that was unknown to me. I had not really worked on a 3-speed internal hub before. Both of these factors worked against me. But as always, I jump in and start doing things, taking apart stuff to see how it works. This was not an exception, and I began removing the lock nuts, spacers, etc. to get at the internal mechanism. I assumed it would simply fall out or some wiggling would cause it to come apart. But the more I tried to remove it, the more I realized something was holding it in place.
Okay, so I took apart some of this 3-speed, but the technology beat me, strangely enough. It's very interesting. I learned that this has a planetary gear set on the inside, which is what uses what it uses for its gearing, and I see that this axle will actually shift back and forth, which is probably the way that it actually does some of the gearing. Again, this is new to me because I've never really had the chance to take apart something this old and to see what all goes inside. and I'm very impressed by the ingenuity, and also by I'm somewhat chagrined at the lack of knowledge that I have about this thing. But I'm an engineer, so I take things apart and I figure things out. And when I can't figure things out, oh well, I couldn't figure it out. Then I ask questions. So, but it looks like what I'm going to do then is, because it does have an external grease port here, what I will do is I'll clean up all the bearings that I can. I'll clean these all up really good, and because it has several groups of bearings on different sides. There's one on the drive side. This is the drive side. There's another one on inside here, which is obviously for the non-drive side, and this one is no doubt to help to control some of the rotation inside the actual hub itself. So I'll do my best to clean this up, and because of the fact it's such a closed system, I feel pretty comfortable that I can just get it working. That's really what I want. I'm not going to be able to completely break it down. I just don't know how. I can't get this thing out. I can see there's some pawls around here that if I could possibly, get something inside and close those down, and maybe this thing would slide out. I don't know. All I can say is that it seems to be somewhat worn, but at the same time doesn't seem to be too bad. So I'll just simply fix this, put it back together, and I'll cross my fingers that I did a good enough job that it'll run on the bike.
After cleaning up all the parts as best possible, I began the reassembly process. There was not too much wear and tear, therefore I was relatively confident that putting this together would not cause me too much issue. I cleaned everything with mineral spirits and then began the assembly process, repacking the bearings with new grease. The assembly process was straightforward, even though I didn't know exactly where everything went. Things were for the most part intuitive, even though there were a lot of small pieces with which I was unfamiliar.
Okay, so I was able to get it back together again, at least to my satisfaction. I think it'll be okay. It's just slightly stiff in one of the spots there, but I believe that with what I did, it should be okay. Probably maybe just something a little displaced. I did find that there was one piece I could not put in there, and that is this. There's a little bit. I don't know if this is a spring or some sort of a seal or a pawl retainer. I don't know what it is, but this I couldn't figure out where this thing goes. So this is one of the classic examples of it doesn't seem to be an extra part, but it's not going in any place that I could figure out where it would go. So I will cross my fingers that it will work fine, even though it may not have that thing in there. Maybe this was something that had broken, and it could have possibly even been causing problems inside the internal mechanism. But regardless, it seems to be good, and I have been able to understand how, again, see how the rotation now as I rotate the sprocket, that it makes the axle rotate faster, and that is how that planetary gear set works inside. Just amazing. This just the ingenuity back then was incredible. They didn't have computers. They didn't have anything that they would be able to. They had to figure this stuff out all on their own. And I just, kudos to them. Just, a true engineer in trying to figure out how to make something work. So I'm just really amazed at how this works. And years and years and years later, we don't have to deal with that kind of stuff anymore. It's all computerized stuff, CNC manufactured, and things like that. Even 3D printed to an extent. But these guys had to figure it out on their own, and just amazing. It really is. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put together the shifter piece itself. Well, actually, I probably won't put this on just yet. What I want to do now is actually take off the rim, clean the rim, clean the spokes, and replace that one spoke that's bad. And I left the tire on purpose because I didn't want to take the tire off and then have the rim maybe get damaged or something like that. So now I'm going to take off the tire as well. I was thinking about maybe keeping this tire, but I've seen that as I flex it in certain parts, it's cracking right at the sidewall. and I don't think that's a good idea to keep this. So I'm probably gonna have to buy two brand new tires for the front and back wheels. And then so what I also, as I began to think about this a little bit more, then this port that is here, I was saying was a grease port, and I think it is not a grease port. I think this is an oil port, because what it probably uses inside is gear oil, just as if it were a manual transmission. So, you know, again, the good thing is that as I'm working on these bikes, I'm thinking about what is going on here. What is it trying to do? What are we trying to achieve here, and how is it being achieved? And so, like I say, I think that this is just simply an oil port now. And since I do have a manual transmission car, strangely enough, well, ironically enough, then I will actually use some of that gear oil in the transmission here. And I hope that will then protect the internal mechanism so that it continue to work as it should. Okay, so I have this 75 weight 90 gear oil, which of course is for an automotive. It's for cars. You know, it's an automotive type of gear oil. But since I really have no specs, I can't really determine what the real value should be. And there's so many different gear oil ratings and under the sun. I'm just gonna kind of wing it and just say, okay, I've got something, might as well just put it in there. It's better than nothing, and hopefully it'll last a while. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go like this, and I'm just going to put it right like this, and I'm going to see if I can, just because I don't really have a tube, and I'm kind of making a mess here, I see, but let's give it a little bit of, so just drop by drop putting it in there, because I really don't have any other effective way of adding my gear oil. Since I'm taking apart this whole hub anyway to take off the spokes, then I can clean this thing up later. So I'm not too concerned about making a bit of a mess, which is exactly what I'm doing. I'm getting gear oil all over the spokes and down onto the rim, the tire. Not a big deal right now. That's all gonna be fixed.
I then started the wheel disassembly by removing the spokes and inspecting the spoke nipples. Overall, I didn't see anything obvious. The spokes were a little opaque and aged, but that is to be expected for a bike that's 60 years old. The nipples weren't too bad either, so I thought that this should be a quick clean and reassembly. Silly me. I did have a bit of a time removing the spoke nipple off the broken spoke, only because it had sheared off just above the nipple itself. The problem was that I didn't have much purchase and struggled to find something that would be able to hold on to it strongly enough to allow me to unscrew it. I was finally able to get some vice grips and get it off, therefore I felt good that it would be a simple reuse along with the other spoke nipples. Once I had everything disassembled, I began the process of cleaning the rim. It had significant grime and some slight rust, but wasn't too bad. However, as I cleaned and removed the deposits, the true finish came out, and what a shine. Just like the headset lock nut, the chrome was just absolutely stunning with hardly a scratch. Considering the years, I attribute this to something like a miracle. Just breathtaking.
Okay, so I had to do something that I typically don't do, and that is actually go out and buy some spokes, because the original spokes that I had, I simply didn't have the right size, and to avoid trying to mismatch some spokes, then I went ahead and just bought a new set of 36, and we will open them up now. And they come with their spoke nipples as well as the spokes themselves. So what we're gonna do then is just go ahead and start to build this wheel out with these spokes. And hopefully I got the right measurement. Obviously I was able to use the originals, and that should be good. And I noticed that these spoke nipples also are not the standard, I shouldn't say standard, I should say they're not the typical 12 millimeter, looks like, well actually these are the 12 millimeter. There are some 8 millimeter ones out there as well, but yeah, those probably will not work with this. However, because of the fact this is a single wall steel rim, which by the way, I should mention is looking fantastic. This Orion rim is just beautiful once I got this thing cleaned up. It just, the shine of this thing is, I mean, just a mirror shine. And considering the age of this thing, I'm blown away by how well this has been able to resist the weather and the, a scuffing and abuse or whatever this may have gone through. And I'm almost tempted now to go back to the front wheel and redo that wheel to kind of match this, because now I'm kind of feeling a little bad that I just simply said, well, it's fine, I'll just go ahead and let it go and move on with the rear wheel. But because now that I've done this, yeah, I'm just amazing, just an amazing finish. It doesn't even look like it's even scratched hardly at all. I mean, come on. So regardless, I will go ahead and do the build in this one, put the hub and the spokes on the rim, and we'll go ahead and take it from there. And then we'll start to look at the hub, because I'm seeing that the shifting is not quite there. But that's just something to deal with in this as part of this whole process.
With the hub now separate, I was able to easily clean the surface. And as with the other chromed pieces, this one was also in excellent condition. The debris came off without issue and the finish was amazing. Armed with my new spokes, I then started reassembling the wheel. Since I had new spoke nipples with the new spokes, and also because the old spokes now looked dingy compared to the incredible looking rim, I obviously had to use the new nipples as well. The assembly itself was rather simple, and I was relieved to see that the spoke length was appropriate for the wheel. As I was adding the spoke nipples, I also was greasing them, as is my new approach, which seems to reduce the need for additional flexing and truing as I have had to do in the past. Once assembled, I trued the wheel, confirming the rim was straight and not damaged. From there, I put on rim tape, added the tube and tire, and inflated to confirm no leaks in the tube. I then mounted the rear wheel on the bike, and at this point I thought I had completed the wheel and could move on to other things. However, as I began testing the shifting on the bike, I realized it wasn't shifting correctly. I removed the wheel and then started to investigate the internal mechanism to see what was causing the issue. I did this several times, changing the pieces around inside, trying to get them to shift. Well, as karma would have it, I lost the smallest piece inside. It dropped somewhere, and since of course I have a spotless garage, it disappeared somewhere. To make matters worse, something happened to the mechanism that did not allow it to seat properly. I even went as far as trying to bang off that retainer, that bearing cup retainer, just by brute force. When that didn't work, then I tried to remove, or at least have the cassette seat back down inside the housing with some cards, trying to just insert the pawls just so the pawls would drop back down. And even though I was able to get it to seat once, and I thought, fantastic, I shifted it and it popped back out again, and I was like, forget it. I'm wasting my time here trying to struggle with this thing, knowing that I'm missing a part. So I decided to move on to the next step.
Okay, so great news. I found an old, as you see, I keep all my old junk and stuff like that. I found an old 26-inch wheel that also has a Shimano 3-speed hub on it. And it's in not the best condition, but it is slightly newer than the one that was on the original Bluegrass. So I think what I might do, and since this is also a 36-hole wheel, the hub, I mean, for the 36 spokes on this wheel, what I'm thinking of doing is just maybe just cleaning this up and just confirming that it looks good on the inside. Because the other one had a problem with the shifting, I'll just confirm that the shifting on this one does work. And if that is the case, I'm looking good. And I'll just go ahead, like I say, to clean this up, and I'll just remove this off this wheel, just take off the spokes, and then put this back on the other one, and everything will be fine. So again, more on this as I begin to take this thing apart and all that stuff. You can see that this wheel has been around many years, of course, because most 3-speed bikes are considered vintage bikes anyway, just because of the fact they were only made up to maybe like the late 70s, and then they shifted over to the standard freewheel hubs and stuff like that because they wanted to have more, they started to do the external gearing and stuff like that. They still do have internal gearing. There's some 7-speed Nexus, Shimano's Nexus hubs that are still around, but they're quite expensive, and only if you don't want to see the external gearing. And like I say, I would say 90 to 95% of all bikes do have external gearing, meaning a 5-speed, 6-speed, 7-speed, up to 11 or 12 speeds on some of these bikes, depending on what it is. Regardless, all I can see is that it is a freewheel, so this is very, very ubiquitous with this brand. And it looks like, say, it has most of the hardware here, a little bit rusted, like I say, just a little bit rusted on this side. You can see the sprocket. I may just use the other sprocket, because the other sprocket here, if I can find it, is here, which is in much better condition here. So again, I think that maybe I'll remove some of the hardware and just replace it with some of the stuff that I have for my parts from the other one. But regardless, this says, and it's a little stiff. It's not too bad. We'll see. Like I say, I'll take a look at this thing as I take it apart, and we'll go from there.
So to start with, I wanted to illustrate the stark difference between the original hub and my replacement. You can see the significant amount of rust and corrosion, indicating that this wheel was not well kept. This would be what I would expect from a 60-year-old bike. Regardless, since this was all I had, and since I love restoring, I had hopes that this would turn out okay. I removed the spokes and rim and tossed them, since even I doubt I would be able to use them, and began inspecting the exterior. Even though it was a little beat up, it did seem mechanically sound, and I believe this hub is a G-type hub, whereas the first was an FA-type hub. The critical difference was that this did not require the special tool I did not have, therefore I was able to take apart the internal mechanism, and even though it was slightly different, I was able to recognize the major parts and their location. The parts were a little gummy, meaning that they were not well greased, but that was to be expected considering the age. I was able to clean the bearings, the pawls, the planetary gear set, and all the internal mechanism, and reassemble as I was hoping to with the first hub. Because I was able to completely remove the internal gearing, I was able to clean and inspect it much closer than the FA hub. To my surprise and pleasure, it looked great and did not have significant wear. I lubricated all the pieces and reassembled. This time the reassembly was rather straightforward and no parts were lost. It was at this time that I was able to locate a video that showed the breakdown and reassembly of the FA type hub. But unfortunately, since the critical piece that I was missing was gone, then it was not really that helpful at this point. But it also did not show the exact orientation of the pieces, the internal pieces for the shifting, and it required me moving things around and kind of trying different configurations before I was finally able to get it to work correctly. Also, with additional research, I found the manuals for some of the older 3-speed hubs, including the schematics for Shimano and Sturmey Archer, the two most notable hub manufacturers of that time. Now I wish I would have had that information prior, but at least I figured it out with some help. After the rear wheel debacle, the rest of the bike was a breeze to restore. I did spend a significant amount of time working on the fenders, and even though there was plenty of surface rust, as with this bike, there was a decent coating of chrome that was just waiting to come out and shine. A moderate dent on the back fender also detracted from the aesthetics of the bike. Steel wool is, as always, my best tool for removing rust, but in some of the hard to reach spots, I did use the Dremel tool with some light pressure to remove what I couldn't reach. It was missing a rear reflector as well, but I figured I could leave that as is. And as you can see, the results were quite remarkable. I then mounted the fenders on the bike. I had to remove the front wheel because, as you can see, the front fender is affixed with the front axle and a single screw under the fork for support. After screwing in the mounting screw under the fork, it was rather easy to set the fender when remounting the wheel. The rear fender was a little bit more complicated.
There were 2 screws on each side for the fender braces. Then there was one under the rear brake cross member and one on the kickstand support brace. It won't move on me now. The 3-speed shifter presented an interesting task in that it was simple yet effective in its design. The shifter was integrated into the handlebar grip and was a simple rotation of the wrist to actuate. A ball bearing on the underside kept it in the desired gear, and the grip was held in place by a small bracket. Now the adjustable barrel had been broken, so I dug around until I found something similar. I thought it was the same thread size, but strangely enough was slightly off. Since it was so close, I thought that it would be best to tap the shifter out to allow the new thread accommodation. The process was simple yet effective, and I avoided having to buy a new connector, of which I doubted I would find anyway. Once I had it tapped, I then realized that the way the Shimano 3-speed cable works is that there are pieces mounted on each side, one for the shifter and the other for the connector to the shifter on the axle. This presented a problem since I could not thread the cable inside the adjustable barrel. Therefore, what I did was to cut a groove with a cutoff wheel on my Dremel tool into the adjustable barrel and allow the insertion of the cable. The grip itself was somewhat scuffed and yellow due to age, but still was what I considered passable and not needing much in the way of modification. After disassembly, the parts were all cleaned and polished to my satisfaction, and the grease added to the ball bearing for easy shifting. The screws were a little rusted, but some polishing also cleaned them up adequately. By this time, I was feeling smug with myself, thinking I had solved all my problems. I initially was going to use a Shimano 3-speed cable. It was basically considered an old new stock, they call it NOS, and that new old stock is basically just a Shimano 3-speed cable that's been sitting around in somebody's warehouse for a long time. But when I added the cable to the shifter on the bike, well, I realized the cable was too short. So I really couldn't use it after all, and so I just had to accept the fact that it was not going to work. So at that point then I did a little research and found that I would probably need to spend some more money to get a longer cable. But as I started doing more investigation, I realized I may not be able to. So when I did that review, I actually remembered that I had actually bought an aftermarket 3-speed shifter cable that did not have the same Shimano OEM specifications. It was actually more of a universal type approach, which was much easier to use. And even though the cable guide was black and not wide, I figured I would take the lesser of the two evils and go with the black cable housing for both the shifter and the brakes. I also made sure that the cable was long enough before going down any rabbit holes. After cutting the cable to length and adding the cable and fray protector, I added a small piece of electrical tape so that the cable did not rub against the bike frame. And then I tested it through shifting to make sure that it was all done correctly. In order to overhaul the brakes, I needed to complete the fenders. That way I didn't try to fit the fenders inside the brake calipers. As you can see, the brakes looked dingy and not so good. The screws were rusty, the caliper arms were pitted with rust as well, and the brake levers were definitely showing their age. Regardless, I dove in as I always do. Luckily, they were really easy to recondition, although I did completely break them down and clean everything. I hate to say it again, but the chrome looked amazing after polishing. I was able to mount them over the fenders without any issues. I then moved on to the brake levers, and again the engineering is simple in design yet effective. A simple bolt and nut were all that was used to hold the brake lever together. They were all metal construction and had decent chrome, but some pitting was noted, especially on the underside of the levers. I was able to clean them using my buffing wheel, bringing out that shine without difficulty. For some of the harder to reach spots, my handheld Dremel tool worked wonders. The last piece to restore was the original kickstand. It had, as the rest, seen better days, but the simplicity made it an easy restore. I removed the retention pin and flange, then removed the spring. The standard cleaning process was in order, and once it was complete, it worked like a charm, although it was a little loose after greasing it. Regardless, it still holds the bike up, so that's really what it's all about. So I just finished the bike ride with the Bluegrass, and it rides fantastic, looks fantastic. Just an awesome looking bike. Fenders turn out fantastic. I'm amazed at how well they shone after the rust that was on there. You can see that there is that one spot there. Of course, it was a ding. I got a little bit of it out there. You can see it's not quite perfectly flat, but again, that's one of the things you have to deal with when you restore something. Again, everything here looks great. Still has the original stickers on the front, as well as the badge sticker. Put some reflectors on there just so it kept the safety aspect. Of course, it has the built-in reflectors on the side, and the pedals do not have reflectors, as you can see. I don't know if they ever had them at one time. Oh, they do. It looks like a couple fell off, but again, I don't have that, so I'm not going to be able to replace those. But again, put some newer reflectors on here. On the back, I was able to press in a bolt into this reflector so I could bolt that onto the back there. Again, brakes fantastic, amazing, just phenomenal look here. Just the whole thing just turned out amazing. I couldn't believe how well this turned out. So until the next video, like, subscribe, share, whatever you want to do. Leave a comment and we will move on to the next restore.